Thank you very, very much for having me here today. I really appreciate the ability to speak to all of you. As you can tell, my background generally has been as a consumer of data and evidence, and not as a producer of it. And it largely comes from my experiences on the legislative side of policymaking, trying to improve the ability to have data and evidence in policymaking, and then using data and evidence as we've moved legislation through the Congress. I'd like to talk a bit about 4 issues, as I view it, relating to the use of evidence and data in the policymaking process. The first issue would be the role, just the broad role of evidence and data in the policymaking process. So what role does it play? How do we view evidence as a seat in the table versus sort of driving policy? Second, how can data and evidence best be incorporated into the policymaking process? What is it that ensures that evidence is used by policymakers as they're trying to develop reforms programs? Third is just sort of a case study almost approach to some of the recent areas where data and evidence were used and used extensively as policymakers were trying to identify good reforms programs. And then finally, sort of looking towards the future a little bit and sort of looking at how we can ensure that data and evidence continue to play a growing role as we try to improve evidence. So first, sort of what's the role of evidence and data in the policymaking process? I do want to say at the very outset is a lot of people think that the Congress especially does not use evidence or data as they are trying to develop reforms programs, create new programs, or legislate generally. And I think that is a really, it's a misreading of what the Congress does, based in large part on sort of the broader news sort of atmosphere that a lot of what Congress does is viewed at. So I think most of the policymaking in the Congress is done at the committee level, where most of the key granular issues are decided. And the data and the evidence there is what committee staff are looking at very, very closely at. So data and evidence are really, really key to the broader policymaking apparatus. The issue, though, is where does evidence sort of fit into decision makers' sort of issue set? And policymaking is always going to be driven by values and values about specific policies. And where evidence plays its greatest role and most important role is it clarifies trade-offs between those values. And the clarifying of the trade-offs can allow for policy to go into law where it otherwise would not go into law. I think a key area here, as one idea, the McV, the Maternal Infant and Early Childhood Visitation Program, that was a program where we were able to move that into law in large part because there's strong evidence base behind it. So you had Republicans who generally on the right were concerned about spending money on social services programs, especially if they didn't view them as sort of getting a bang for the buck. And then you had Democrats and then the folks on the left who want to ensure that individuals who are very vulnerable receive social services as much as possible. The ability for sort of the strong evidence base to sort of clarify the trade-offs there and lead to legislation going to law, I think is really, really important. So I think that's some of the key role that evidence and data plays in policymaking more generally. So how does evidence, the use of evidence in policymaking, how can it be used in the most effective way? And I would point to sort of 5 things that I think are really, really important at ensuring that evidence has a seat at the table in the policymaking process. The first one is just timing. I think timing is critically important. If evidence isn't presented in a timely manner, then it fundamentally does not matter. I think that's sort of fairly self-explanatory. If you're trying, one of the issues sort of we looked at one point was when I was at the Ways and Means Committee, we were looking to reform the disability insurance program back in 2015 timeframe when the DI trust fund was about to be exempted. And one of the things that both the conservatives, sort of the Republican policymakers on the committee and Democratic policymakers on the committee were really interested in was how can we sort of improve work incentives in the program. There's a key sort of fight or disagreement amongst what the data and evidence showed around behavior of individuals who were on the disability insurance program and their earnings level and what that meant. We did not have the evidence to sort of to settle that dispute in any way. And so what we ended up having to do was to create a pilot project where we were trying to hopefully develop a broader evidence base that could show sort of provide additional answers to individuals. But timing is sort of critically important. I think trustworthiness, I think, is the second one. And I would say this is probably the most important issue for folks that are generating evidence to identify and work on to develop relationships with decision makers and policymakers. Policymakers generally have more information they can possibly process. When I was in the speaker's office, I generally was meeting with various individuals from around 10 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock at night, and I was trying to get my work generally done before 10 and after 4. Because of this, policymakers generally develop heuristic shortcuts in order to streamline their decision-making process. They have trusted relationships with individuals at think tanks, at agencies, at lobbyists sometimes, that they trust to provide them with fairly unbiased information. And this, from a policymaking perspective, I think this goes both ways, from both a congressional and agency perspective. When I was on the Ways and Means Committee, again, I was the staff director of the Social Security Subcommittee. There was probably at the beginning of that relationship a bit of skepticism between our office and the Social Security, sort of, it was an Obama administration, sort of ledge affairs folks. We were able to really develop a really strong relationship around a story that came out regarding the Death Master file and the fact that I think 60 Minutes did a quote unquote expose on the fact that Social Security had a bunch of deceased individuals and they hadn't cleaned up the rolls yet. Well, you know, we had a really long conversation with the Social Security Administration where they discussed basically, well, this doesn't, no dollars are flowing out. And we do not, it costs a lot of money to clean up these rolls. And so, you know, I had a long conversation with the members that I was working with who were really annoyed about this. And we were able to get them to basically not attack the Social Security Administration. And after that, the fact that the administration or the agency saw that we're not going to attack them for things that were outside of their control or were sort of dumb, they were much more frank with us. And it was a much more useful relationship. And I was able to trust them a lot more in terms of the information that they were sharing and using. And so I think having a trustworthy relationship and a lot of trust between individuals is probably the key issue in terms of getting evidence accepted by policymakers. A couple of the other issues, evidence needs to be compelling. Policymakers need to care about the evidence. So when you are talking to policymakers and individuals, make sure you are tailoring what you're saying to those individuals. Some people care a lot about education policy, other people do not. And so making sure that you are sort of talking to the person that cares about it will make sure that you're not wasting your time as you generate evidence. Clarity, that's a big issue as well. I mean, I think there are issues where there just isn't clarity around the sign. There has to be some sort of clarity around sort of the sign of where the policy needs to go in order to have the evidence be useful. I think one good example of this is probably around in the early 2010s, there was some momentum around sort of the charter school movement, broader school reform movements. You sort of had the Newark example with then Mayor Cory Booker pushing some reforms around that. I think at the end of the day, there ended up not being a super clear sign over what the evidence showed in terms of improving outcomes for students. And because of that, you were able to allow people, you know, who have, again, differing values to sort of retreat back into partisan posturing and political posturing around what can happen. And some of that's good, right? If there's not a clear evidence base to make decisions on, then developing additional evidence is a good response to that. And then finally, luck. I think luck is an incredibly important and probably slightly overlooked aspect of this. I used to tell people that even when things look good in terms of moving legislation, there's probably at most a 25% chance that something would actually move into law. And so sort of recognizing that you need to be a bit lucky and having the right people combine at the right time to move legislation is really important. Um, I think sort of identifying a couple successes and how that ended up working out. I think two areas that I would point to. One is Families First. The Families First Preventative Services Act um, uh, was fundamentally a piece of legislation that was about the evidence generated by Title IV-E waivers. Those were the waivers that were designed to allow states to experiment with new ways to improve the foster care system. And I think it hit each one of those 5 notes. It was compelling. I mean, the foster care system remains a scandal in certain respects, the way some of the most vulnerable members of our society and the outcomes that they have had coming out of the Title IV-E system. And so policymakers, I think, were very, very interested in looking at ways to improve that system. I think there's a fairly clear sign in terms of prevention was going to improve those outcomes, preventing children from entering the foster care system in the first place, if you could have evidence-based interventions. You had a trustworthy sort of mediator of the evidence to both the left and the right. The Casey Family Foundation had developed strong relationships with both sides of the aisle. I first worked with them when I was at the budget committee, so that was in the 2014 and earlier time frame, and they had sort of developed a strong relationship with me and others in that process, where we trusted the work that they had done and coming out of that. The timing, I think the timing worked out fairly well. They had roughly a decade where evidence was being provided. And then finally, there was a lot of luck associated with that. At the time, you had California, I think, was probably one of the larger states that had concerns. They had a lot of strong policies that they had used the Title IV-E waivers. And so they were probably one of the states that was going to have the most difficulty complying with some of this. And they had, at the time, we had, the minority leader at the time, Nancy Pelosi, had a lot of influence within that. And so they were able to work closely with them to ensure that their concerns were assuaged. And at the same time, you had a Republican speaker, Speaker Ryan, that cared deeply about the issue. In previous times, the way we passed that law, you'd see a lot of times Republicans or others trying to leverage that for additional policy gains for different priorities because the speaker cared a lot about it. He did not try to leverage it, and we tried to push it in as much as possible and work closely with our Senate colleagues, with then Chairman Hatch and Ranking Member Wyden on the Finance Committee. So I think that is one area where you saw that strong evidence really providing a good outcome from a legislative perspective. And then another one that's been in the news and is, I think, really important is criminal justice reform. You had state actors experimenting on ways they could reduce recidivism while also reducing incarceration. Their leadership and experience basically led to the passage of the First Step Act. I think it's compelling to a lot of policymakers on both the left and the right. There's been sort of a sustained and continued interest in the carceral state and how to reduce it. There was clear evidence around these state level programs that you can both reduce recidivism while protecting public safety and protecting victims, I think, which is really, really important. It was also trustworthy. A lot of conservative states led the way on much of criminal justice reform. It's a very large boost, for at least on the center right and right perspective, when it's Texas and the state of Texas coming in to tell you, hey, these are things that you can do. And they provided counterintuitive and trustworthy validators for especially previous conservative opponents. And then timing. I think evidence was being provided as concerns of over incarceration was growing. I mean, there's a bit of a chicken and egg issue around the timing. There was clearly a lot of concerns already, and that's why states began to experiment, but that led to federal action as well. And then luck, you had a conservative president with the Trump administration, and some of his senior advisor, Jared Kushner, was extremely passionate about this issue. You had a Speaker of the House who also made it a priority. You also had Democrats that were willing to provide, I think, cover. When we moved the bill through the House, it didn't go quite as far as a lot of advocates went, and a lot of Democrats, Akeem Jeffries especially, was a real leader on this, basically said, no, we're going to move this, we're going to try to improve it, and we're going to call it explicitly the First Step Act. But it was able to move because of, people wanted to make a law and see progress. And then, and it pains me to admit this as a House guy, the Senate actually did improve the bill, and it came back to the House and eventually passed in an approved way. So I think those are two areas where you saw large reforms. I mean, the Families First was the first reform to the Title IV-E program since the 1980s, and then the criminal justice reform bill that we passed, the First Step Act, was probably the largest reform since the 1994 crime bill, and in that sector. And those they happened because evidence and data sort of really showed the way to policymakers. And then finally, I think going forward, so I worked for Congress for over a decade, and a lot of people become cynical, I guess, but I remain a huge optimist about the use of evidence in policymaking. If you can't tell, sort of by my sort of past couple slides, I think the news headlines are dominated by sort of political flashpoints around budgets and taxes and all of these things, where values really are, to a certain extent, you can't find common ground. I think especially in the social services space, though, evidence plays an incredibly key role. I used to tell a lot of folks who came into my office basically that one of the really satisfying things about working on these issues is that there's not a lot of the non interested. There's a lot of interest groups per se, but there's no business interest generally in this space. And so a lot of what you really are arguing about is policy and how that is sort of determined by the evidence and the data that you review. And there's a lot of disagreements around the evidence on this, but to the extent that there becomes a consensus on evidence in these various spaces, especially in the anti-poverty space, you can move and you can move fairly quickly, I think, as we saw. I think we saw that. I mentioned a couple, but not just Families First and criminal justice and McVie, but we passed a juvenile justice bill, reauthorization, Perkins CTE, the Career Tech Ed bill, CIPRA was mentioned, opioid legislation. All of these things were really determined in large part on the best evidence that Congress could identify at the moment. So as sort of you think of sort of what is the best way to get evidence in the future and making research relevant, I think a couple things. One, identify issues that aren't sort of high profile issues. I think taxes are going to be super high profile regardless. I think sort of large budget debates are going to be super high profile. But if you look at sort of specific programmatic reforms, I think that is extremely helpful in terms of Congress and will be extremely valuable in terms of moving the needle. Two, I think identifying sort of the federal nexus between research and local action and identifying reauthorizations that are coming up. I think in terms of that timing issue, ensuring that there's going to be a reauthorization happening in the near future, I think is really important. Or, ensuring that something hasn't just been reauthorized so that, you can have your research be useful, I think is helpful. And then finally, I think the Evidence Act is going to play an extremely important role going forward in terms of promoting evidence in the policymaking process. We're still in the beginning stages of the implementation, but I would point to three areas that I think are really, really important and that I think will provide a really good sort of beginning to ensure that evidence is used in the policymaking process. First, I think the learning agendas, if the agencies use them well and they bring in a number of sort of stakeholders to ensure that you get to a good a learning agenda that's useful, I think will be incredibly useful. One of the things that the last one of the panel discussions last time talked about was the need to identify outcomes a little bit better. And I think that's actually a huge issue, both from the congressional perspective and from an agency perspective. It's a little unfair to agencies who are trying to identify outcomes, and I try to ensure that they're complying with what Congress wants to do if Congress isn't very specific in what they want. And so I think the learning agendas can be a really good sort of nexus between agencies and the Congress around that. I also think the evaluation officers are going to be really, really important in terms of beginning to really evaluate programs in a systematic way and in a way that the Congress finds useful, hopefully. And then the chief data officers, I think incredibly important for researchers outside the government especially, but also internally, to ensure that the data that the government currently collects is used in an effective and useful way. So I think I think I'm out of time, so I don't want to keep on talking. I just end with, I think the importance of this cannot be understated. And I think what you guys do is probably one of the single most important thing in terms of ensuring good policy comes out of the Congress um, that can be done. So thank you for all the work that you do. And thank you so much for allowing me to speak to you today.